Hey folks, so you might be wondering why I'm recording this in this way. It's because I'm on a family holiday in a caravan right now, and I wasn't planning on making this video at least. But I was watching Teal Deer's op-ed, Why Do Some Say Islamophobia is Racism? And it's a very interesting video because he's approaching it. This isn't a criticism of him, actually, and it's not me trying to start drama. I think he does good work. He's a good voice against the forces of the regressive left, and we should value and cherish each one of them we find. I do hate the infighting. I really do. People start getting big audiences and they think, oh, the job's done. It's not done. And he's, like I said, he's doing a good job. But the thing is, he's looking at the Islamophobia as racism from the bottom up, and that's appropriate. I mean, most people do. I did until recently. Um, So the general thrust of what he's saying is he's observed many comment sections, many online discourses with people who have really they've internalized the idea that if you criticize Islam, that's racism, and obviously anyone outside of social justice, even people who criticize it on a daily basis, are not going to really understand why that's the case. And to be honest with you, I don't think that the people we end up dealing with online even have any idea themselves. I don't think that they can fully explain or properly articulate why they think that Islamophobia is racism, because everything Teal says is correct about that. It's not a race. It's a ridiculous proposition to anyone who's a normal thinker. However, I've been reading those evil postmodernists. This is Falguni Sheth's Towards a Political Philosophy of Race. Now, Falguni Sheth is a associate professor emeritus, I think, of some university in America. Obviously, she writes for Salon and a bunch of other regressive outlets like that, Alternet, a bunch of others. And I've been reading this book because it's very interesting. Now, this is the postmodernism that Jordan Peterson is always talking about, and it's right that he talks about it because it's nonsense. It's not true, right? It's not true. I'm not just going to call it just nonsense. What it is a very, very abstract and roundabout way of talking about something that I would have thought any political philosopher with a solid understanding of the state should be able to identify and articulate in about a paragraph. But I'm not even very far into this. I'm only in the first chapter. But thankfully, Sheth basically lays out her entire argument in the first 30 odd pages, and then spends the rest of her time explaining why she thinks this. And she does quite a good job of explaining her thoughts that are incredibly complex. And there's no doubt you've got to be someone who's very intelligent to be a postmodernist, because this stuff is interesting in a way. It's also, I mean, I don't want to just call it nonsense, because it's not just nonsense, but it is unnecessarily complex. So the Teal Deer has done a good job of coming at this from the bottom up and identifying accurately why these people are wrong. From, I guess we'll call them a normie's point of view, but from the postmodern point of view, this is coming from the top down, and it is a postmodern concept that to be Islamophobic is to be racist. And I'm going to do my best to explain why, and I'm probably going to blunder around a bit because it is complex stuff. And honestly, I've only been reading this for a few days now. Actually, I tried reading it before, but frankly, I wasn't philosophically equipped to deal with this before, but I am now. That's why I'm tackling it. So, Sheth, like the other postmodernists, view the world in a top-down way. This is why they always approach things from a top-down perspective. Now, the purpose of Sheth's theory is to discuss the discourse of sovereign power. What that effectively means is the state, the power center at the top of society, and how it manages what she calls unruly populations in order to naturalize them into its own sphere of influence and to make them something that is not going to eventually undermine and overthrow the state. In her case, she's talking about liberal democracies, and she does even say at one point, liberal democracies have difficulty talking about the power differential between rulers and the ruled. She doesn't explain why, at least in the part I've read, though. I mean, the reason why is obvious. It's because the rulers come from the ruled in a liberal democracy, which is the best way to do any of this that we've discovered so far. But it's beside the point. So the point is, she defines these as unruly groups. And what she says is that the state finds things about these groups, signifiers. So what she says is that the state, in order to maintain its own power and hegemony over the nation that it governs, needs to categorize its own people, the populations it controls, in order to manage them. And that's not untrue, in a way. I'll go into it in another video. The way that this is complicated stuff, and I want to accurately represent Sheth's opinions. So the way that sovereign power operates in this regard is to categorize people by whatever. And this is something that Sheth calls, I mean, this could be not just race, like, not, I don't want to use the word race, because this is a very specific word that she defines in a very specific way. So the state categorizes people by signifiers. Now, these could be genetic and skin color. This could be cultural. These could be, like, wearing hijab. This could be a certain kind of religion. It could be anything. And so what she calls these categorizations, we would probably normally call classes. We would normally use the term class to define these groups of people that have been marked out by signifiers. Maybe even ethnicities would be a good word to use. But Sheth, for some reason, jumps right to the word race. And then she has to spend all of this time decoupling the word race from what she calls the objectivist and the constructivist arguments. So is race biological or is it socially constructed? And to get around having this argument, Sheth just decouples the entire argument and say, well, that's something I don't need to worry about because I'm going to call a race something that is defined by the state. So it's defined by a separate entity that is not in any way connected to these things. Because the state, that sovereign power, is a wonderful term because it's totally ill-defined. It's not even true, actually. It's not ill-defined, but it's abstracted from the people who become sovereign power, the people who actually run the state and control the reins of power in a state and operate it. And so the way that Sheth has done this means that she can not only ignore the question of whether it's biological or social. The answer, in my opinion, is biological, obviously. That's what race is. But that's because I use a standard English definition of the term race. Sheth's redefinition of it is to define the categories of people as races, even though we may not be talking about biology or even necessarily the sort of social construct of it. What we're talking about is just, can we identify differences between people? And the answer is yes. And if so, they become in what she calls otherized. The point is they aren't part of the homogenous group that makes up, and really she's talking in the context of liberal democracies. There probably are other kinds of government that this applies to, but specifically we'll talk about liberal democracies as well. Because what this means, in her opinion, is effectively there is a group of people who can operate well within the liberal democracy, because these people presumably consider themselves to be citizens of the liberal democracy, and they consider themselves to be part of the body politic, although she doesn't use that term. And then you have the otherized. These people are not, and these are the people she calls the unruly, because they do not operate well within a liberal democracy. Again, she doesn't quite say it like this, but this is what she means. These people don't operate well within a liberal democracy. There's something about them, for whatever reason, that the democracy itself objects to. Now, she often uses the term, she often is using black people in America, which is a very American phenomenon, a very unique phenomenon. And the reason that black people ended up with the rights that white people have is because liberalism does not support the kind of racial segregation that happened in America. I mean, she spends a lot of time talking about the one drop rule and how, and various other aspects of segregation. These things are all illiberal, which is why they all ended up going away, because there's no argument from a liberal perspective to enforce these things. These were all part of a previous, older, race-focused paradigm in the United States. Outside of the United States, it makes no sense. And anyway, I'm getting off topic. But the point is, the incorporation of black people into liberal democracy has changed the subject that she has to talk about. So she wants to talk about Muslims. And so when she's talking about the other of Muslims, what she calls this is people who are not naturalized into liberal democracy. And she refers to this term as racialization. This is where the problem lies, because as soon as you use this term, it's too easy to just slip in saying race. And Sheth does this herself in her book. She will define race in a way that is not related to biology, not even related necessarily to even a homogenous racial grouping, like Islam, like Muslims, and even in Islam, it's not a homogenous set of beliefs. So, for example, the Shia and the Sunnis are different in many different ways. One of the most prominent is the way that the Shias flagellate themselves on, I can't remember what holy day it is, but they've got a special holy day, some points in their calendar, where the men go out and whip themselves on the back and cut themselves. This isn't just a Muslim thing. This is a Shia thing, and most Muslims aren't Shias. The overwhelming majority, something like 85%, are Sunni. So, and obviously they're massively sectarian, so they hate the Shias. But that doesn't matter, because in her opinion, sovereign power won't make the distinction because of other signifiers about the identity of Muslim. But this is how they become racialized. So you might have a ginger Muslim, a black Muslim, and an Arab Muslim, and to her, in this worldview, this is all one race. This is a racialized category of people along the term of Muslim. And that's how she, using postmodern philosophy, calls Muslims a race. And this, I think, is what has been filtered down through many more far more inferior minds than Sheth's, because there's no doubting she's a very intelligent woman. This is what gets filtered down through many less intelligent minds. And like I said, it's difficult to use the term racialization without defaulting to a common English definition of race, and Sheth does it herself. And so when you get that to a professor who is less intelligent than Sheth, it's going to be very difficult for that professor to properly articulate these concepts to their students. And even if they do, it's difficult for a student to be able to understand this, especially if they're not. I mean, I can imagine there are plenty of students who just come away from this thinking, right, okay, white people are bad. That's not what she's necessarily saying, because in her mind, there isn't necessarily a difference between white people and black people in the liberal state's perception. They are just not racialized as the other. And so, but Muslims are, because a liberal democracy naturally looks at what Muslims want for their governing system, which is some form of Sharia law. And you've seen the posters of Muslims saying, fuck democracy, no to freedom, we want Islam. And naturally, a liberal democracy has to react with that in recoil and say, no, you just can't have what you're asking for here, because that means the end of the liberal democracy. And so as the sovereign power, the liberal democracy has to otherize the Muslims. And that's perfectly normal and natural if you want to perpetuate a liberal democracy. It's not as far as I can tell so far, Sheth's plan, though. At least that's not the indication she gives. Lots of criticisms of liberal democracy. But the reason for this is the reality. There's no doubting that if millions of Muslims took over a liberal democracy, as we saw in Egypt, they will simply vote for Islamism, and that's the end of your liberal democracy. And so the military then has to intervene, and blah blah blah. So it's not that it can't have Muslims in a liberal democracy, but you can't have Muslims who want Islam as the governing system in a liberal democracy, because that's the end of the democracy. That's the end of liberalism. And so this is why a liberal democracy does this. And Sheth's terminology is they're racialized, therefore you are being the state itself. And this comes from Foucault, and she heavily leans on Foucault, and some other postmoderns like Derrida, but Foucault she leans on the most heavily. This means that, and in Foucault's estimation, and she's adding to his theories. I'm not too familiar with his theories, though, so I'm just going to use hers. This makes the state a racist state. This is what makes a liberal democracy a racist thing, because it specifically needs to categorize things that work within a liberal democracy and things that don't, until these things that don't can become naturalized. And this is why, in the postmodernist conception, these things are racist towards Muslims, because they've categorized race as nothing to do with your biology, and everything to do with whether or not you operate well within a liberal democracy, whether you're unruly or not. The unruly are over here, the liberals are over here. And when I say liberals, I mean anything that isn't going to destroy or undermine the sovereign power of the liberal democracy. And so, in that conception, by those definitions, she's not wrong. But those definitions are nonsense. They're not definitions that anyone with any sense would use. And the problem that she has is that this, at least so far that I can extract from it, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'll walk this back at some point, but she seems to be looking for a world state that governs all human beings, because the idea is that it's making them non-humans. I mean, she even used the term, they're not human like us. And it's like, well, they're not, to be honest. They're a different kind of human with different beliefs, because that's the way things go. This is why I'm not a globalist, frankly, because I don't think that people can all just live in peace and harmony, and I don't think it's possible for us to have a world state that wouldn't be massively unrepresentative of the people it was ruling over. And you can look at the EU for an example of that. But yeah, so it's necessary for a liberal democracy to have boundaries and borders. And this is built into the core of liberalism. I've been thinking about this a lot recently as well. There is no doubt that liberalism is a nationalist movement, a nationalist philosophy. You can't. I mean, that's what Hobbes is defining in Leviathan. No one in liberalism, in the liberal philosopher's tradition, thinks that the state isn't necessary, because the state is there to protect each other from each other, protect us all from each other, to protect our rights from our fellow citizens. We need a superior power above us to be able to do that, because you can't expect a man to be the victim and the judge in his own to arbitrate his own case. So there's no doubt that this is a necessary force in our society. Sheth's contention, though, is that if you classify anything as as the other, which you actually have to do in liberalism, there will be. I mean, don't get me wrong. Everyone could be in a liberal democracy, and you would still have others. But I mean, you'd have much less wars. But you would have to have another, and any other is something that a liberal democracy will, in Sheth's terms, racialize. And like I was saying earlier, that I kind of got off track on. When you start using the term race, because it is such a loaded word, because it is such a word with just, it's so powerful, the word race, and I think that's probably why she's used it. Maybe she doesn't even know why she's used race. I don't know why she didn't just innovate a new word that didn't use the word race. But anyway, this is very easy to turn into racism. And I mean, she does it herself, obviously, with Foucault. But it's very easy to turn to racism even when you're not talking about race, because you've redefined the word race. You've redefined what racialization is. You've decided it can happen to anyone by the sovereign power of the liberal democracy, and therefore that is fundamentally racist and can't not be. And by those terms, that's true. By everyone else's terms, it's nonsense. And so anyone who doesn't understand this as well as Sheth does, or the people proselytizing this postmodernism, won't be able to accurately tell you why it's not racist. They will just say, well, I've been told that it's racist, and they'll probably have some muddled conception of why Islam is a race because of this racialization theory, but it's nothing to do with biology. It's nothing to do with any of that. It's entirely to do with Sheth's conception of what a liberal democracy does to outsiders, which is to not treat them as if they're part of the polity itself. Because obviously it can't. Otherwise that would lead to the destruction of the polity until they've been naturalized and agree that democracy, human rights, and freedom are a good thing. If those people don't think those things are a good thing, which Muslims don't, at least Islamists say don't, then the liberal democracy has to treat them as a hostile outsider, because they are a hostile outsider to at least the philosophy of liberal democracy and the sovereign power that has generated. They have to do this. And so this is why they think it's racist. You can be racist to Muslims. They think the state is racist to Muslims, no matter how much, for example, in my country, the state is pandering to Muslims. And this is why there are people who think Islamophobia is a form of racism, at least from the postmodernist top-down perspective. But as I was saying, going back to Teal Deer, as he was saying, there are definitely people who don't understand this, but who have been drip-fed these ideas slowly over time without really understanding what they're really saying, and so now they just have it in their head. They don't fully understand, but criticizing Muslims is racist. That's what they think. They don't know why, it just is. Don't ask them. It's basically the Gary Johnson fucking defense. No, these things just are as they are. Don't ask me. I don't understand, so I'm just not going to question it. And that's that. And like I said, I mean, it's tough to get your head around this stuff. I'm not going to lie. It is. It requires you to do a lot of thinking, but it is interesting in a lot of ways. But I have not been persuaded by this. I do not agree that using the term race is appropriate for this discussion at all. And as soon as you start saying, well, okay, well, they're just otherizing. Yes, they are. They have to. Otherwise, the liberal democracy will die. And it's better to have a liberal democracy than not. But anyway, good stuff, I think. I look forward to the philosophers tell me why I'm wrong. Because I'm not saying that I've understood this perfectly. I haven't finished the book yet. But Sheth lays out her contentions very early on, which is very useful. And she does it in a way that's surprisingly clear. But what's interesting is that it's very, very, very it's an unnecessarily long route to take to arrive at the same conclusion that any political scientist would give you. But yeah, I look forward to hearing any responses to this, and keep up the good work, Tilda.